morning, everyone. Welcome to CSIS. I'm Kathleen Hicks. I direct the International Security Program here. And on behalf of CSIS and our partners at the U.S. Naval Institute, and in particular, Pete Daly, the CEO of U.S. Naval Institute, we want to welcome you to this Maritime Security Dialogue. Today we are focusing on Congress and Seapower, and to get a view from the Hill, we decided to get two views from the Hill. I'm very pleased to be joined today with Representative Rob Wittman from Virginia, who is the chairman of the Seapower and Projection Forces Subcommittee, and the ranking member of that committee, Representative Joe Courtney from Connecticut. Also, they are the co-chairs of the Congressional Shipbuilding Caucus, so there's a lot that we can cover, I think, here today. As a reminder, the Maritime Security Dialogue is co-hosted, as I said, by CSIS and US Naval Institute. What we seek to do with this series is highlight the current thinking and future challenges facing the Navy, Marine Corps, and Coast Guard. And our event today is the first Maritime Security Dialogue in the 2017 series, and we're looking forward to hosting more of these going forward. We do have a quick security announcement. We feel very safe in our building, but should an alarm go off, as you can see, you all came in through entrances off of Rhode Island Avenue. We also have exits at the back of the building. I am your official safety officer. If something happens, I will direct you which way to go. We have a church that way, and we have National Geographic that way, and depending on the severity of the circumstances, we'll either be at the church or we'll be looking at museum displays. I do also want to mention to you today, as I said, this is the first of our series. We do hope to have a broad-ranging set of discussions, but we very much wanted to start the series this year with Congress. We think, representatives of the people, obviously, you're bringing important constituencies forward, and you're bringing forward a set of issues that are very complicated at this time. And we happen to be having you, quite coincidentally, the week that a big budget deal, for the year at least, we call any budget deal is a big budget deal. So we're getting to September, it sounds like, through September. So I thought I'd just start in an open-ended way to both of you. Maybe I'll start to my left, you all sat on the opposite sides, which is lovely of you, very bipartisan. But perhaps we could start with a little bit of a discussion about, we have this budget deal that gets us through September. We have to look ahead, of course, to 2018. There has been so much attention, rightly, on shipbuilding, but overall, of course, on where the Navy is going as part of our national defense and security. This number of 355 ships, for instance, has been thrown out there. What is your sense about where we are going and the degree to which we're on the path to get where we need to go?
Sure. Well, the current budget agreement that's before us still has some shortfalls there. One of the things that concerns me are the dollars that go into maintaining ships. I'm not certain that we have all the dollars necessary to be able to take all of the 14 ships that are up for service availabilities into the maintenance stream. That's issue one.
Right.
Secondly, as we look forward to next year's budget deliberation and the discussion about the $54 billion additional dollars into defense spending into the base budget, still only gets us slightly above where we were last year with combined OCO and base defense. So we're still, I think, short of where we need to be. And as the Congressional Budget Office study that both Mr. Courtney and I requested and that we got back, we see that it's going to take at least a $5 to $6 billion investment additionally each year in order for us to get on the glide path to 355 ships. So I still think it's going to beg for us to have the discussion about, are there enough dollars, not just in the total defense budget, but as this budget comes out, are there enough dollars devoted to the Navy, and within the Navy budget, are there enough dollars devoted to the shipbuilding accounts to actually get us on track to be able to get to 355? I still think that's a yet to be discussed issue. It's one still that I think is a significant challenge for us, and we have to have the discussion about why 355 ships is so critical. And then two, how can we realistically get there, both with resources and with capability within the industry?
Mm-hmm. So, I agree with a lot of Rob's points as usual, but I would say that I think it's important that this get done because we have to sort of step back and recognize we're 7 months already into the fiscal year, and the perfect is the enemy of the good, I think, is even more pronounced when again, there's just so much more work to do, as Rob said, really, that we should be already focused on. We should already be working on an NDAA for 2018, a budget for 2018. And the fact that this sort of hangover of what I think was an unfortunate decision back in December when the transition team basically stepped in and said, don't do an omnibus, when pretty much the outlines are the same today as they were back in December, that's just sort of a loss of precious time. And having said all that, I mean, I do think that, the negotiators were able to still do some additional military investment, and we'll see how the Navy kind of digests the depot maintenance provision, which was added to the omnibus, the baseline omnibus. And so, again, for no other reason that we can now sort of pivot to what I think is already a late start to the 2018 process. Getting this done, I think, is really, for that reason, beneficial. And I also, think that it's not bad to finally, see with the new administration, new leadership in the Congress, that they actually have found a way to come up with an agreement. I mean, hopefully that's going to be a virtuous cycle that, we'll sort of see repeated more. I mean, the fact, if this thing just continued to sort of drag on, and God forbid a CR, I frankly think, all the goals that Rob talked about in terms of 2018 would have been, I think, even more harmed and undermined than not moving forward with the package that was negotiated.
Is it your sense that this focus that has come around this number, shipbuilding's always sort of, for better or worse, focused on a number, but the 355, do you think that's a realistic and attainable goal? Do you think it's the right goal to have for the Navy for the future? How would you frame the issue?
I would frame the issue as, really, that it's not the agenda of a new administration. I think that's really an important point for everybody to really think about, which is that the process that got to 355 began actually a couple of years ago. And Rob and I have talked about this a lot, which is that when you talk about the magnitude of the undertaking to get to 355, I think it's important for people to sort of recognize we're talking really almost about a generational undertaking, that this is not a one-year budget undertaking. This is going to take a really sort of national commitment that far supersedes really one administration, one Congress, or one party. And so that I think is really, again, another reason why it's so important to move on from the budget here this week. And certainly, I think our committee has not been waiting for the budget in terms of trying to set the table with hearings, and Rob has, organized some really good, particularly for new members, kind of primers in terms of just, what's going on here in terms of the need for enlarging the fleet. But as I said, this is, something that is going to, require a lot of educating, and also, I think really consensus to get to something that big and to achieve something that big. But again, I think the report was grounded on very solid strategic assumptions based on factors that really, again, have nothing to do with any one political agenda.
And that's a great opening to ask you, Congressman Wittman, about the agenda that you see. I mean, as we've indicated, we're partway through the fiscal year already. You all have gone through some hearings, obviously, in the run-up to the assessment on NDAA. How are you thinking about the big challenges now facing you coming into the FY18 cycle?
Well, I think the big challenge for us is looking at this 355 ship number and then dissecting it, looking at then what does the architecture of the Navy look like? What types of ships? How many in each of those classes? What are they doing? Where are the demands on those ships? And then for us, being able to set the proper glide path to get to 355, we need to understand what capacity is in the industry. How much is there? What can they build to? How do we make sure that we create the certainty to where the industry is willing to invest? They're willing to make the commitment to say, yes, this is serious. This isn't going to be a 1 or 2 year endeavor. This is going to be done over the long period of time. So our charge this year with the NDAA is to, as aggressively as we can, begin that glide path to 355. And I think you have to send that signal. I think you have to look at, where can we get industry to start to crank up the effort. It won't necessarily reveal itself in additional ships in the immediate year, but it will, I think, beginning in the very end of the fit-up. And as we look outward from there, if we're going to get there, as the CBO study has shown us, we're going to have to push the issue early on. It takes that $5 to $6 billion commitment annually to get out, 20, 25, 30 years from now, wherever we end up with that, to get to 355 ships. So I think that's our charge right now, is to, as aggressively as we can, with the parameters that we are given, both through the President's budget and, as Joe said, what we can do ourselves. And I think that's critical to emphasize, that we're going to look at what comes to us with the President's budget, but we have to do everything we can as authorizers to send that signal and to put us on the glide path to get to 355, because it is going to be a significant effort. We do not have the industrial-based capacity that we used to have, so we have to send the signal there to make sure that they are going to make the investment to where we understand some of the risk involved with that, to where Navy, too, with us, says, okay, here's what we need to do, here's what we can do, and sharing some of that risk to make sure we have the foundation and the framework to be able to get to 355. It will not be easy. It will be a long-term commitment, but I am confident that we can get there. But we have to do that with an unambivalent signal to say, this is what we're going to do, make no mistake about it. We're on path to 355 ships, and we're on path to building the right ships there, to making sure we put the priorities there, whether they're attack submarines, whether it's aircraft carriers, whether it's surface combatants. The good news is this, is that in every one of those categories, we have hot production lines and mature design. So it's not like we're going down the path now of a brand new ship in a class. I mean, we've gotten past that now with Ford, so that's the good news. And I believe that we can truly send that signal, and we can get that production ramped up to where we can get to 355, I think somewhere in the 25 to 30-year time frame.
How dependent is that on having the current budget cap lifted or raised?
Well, obviously lifting the budget cap would be very helpful. That, I think, has to be part of the discussion. This year it's going to be a maneuver within the discretionary spending space, right, which complicates things, as we had talked about. But I think subsequent to that, you're going to have to talk about the entire budget. You cannot address the issue that we face in 1/3 of the budget, that is 1/2 of 1/3 of the budget in defense spending, without the overall budget discussion taking place also on the autopilot spending programs. You can't get there if you say, well, 2/3 of the budget's off the table. There's only so much you can take that 1/3 of the budget and squeeze it, and then not have an effect on half of that, and not expect there to be vigorous debate about how that affects the other programs in discretionary spending.
So, Congressman Courtney, one of the articles I pulled as I was getting ready this morning is this great headline. It's from neither of your districts, good news, but it was from the San Diego Tribune from January, and the title is "Two Scary Acronyms in a Military Town, BRAC and RIF." So getting to the budget challenges, there obviously is the matter of balancing across discretionary spending, but there's also the issue set of how to drive efficiency, whatever you'd like to call it, cost down, overhead, inside defense. How much do you think that needs to be part of the conversation, and within that, where does BRAC fit?
Well, in Groton we call BRAC a 4-letter word.
Yeah.
So, yeah, it is. I mean, it's been a topic that's come up at our committee, and when Rob was chair of readiness, it was right, on his plate, and all of us on the subcommittee as well. I think the Obama administration requested it at least 3 times, if not 4 times. Yeah. And one thing that I think the subcommittee did with some of the NDAs is we asked the services to come back and be a little more explicit in terms of where the excess capacity was. And what was interesting is that if you look, there really was pretty dramatic variation between the different services. Yeah. Air Force, it was close to 25-30% excess capacity. Army, somewhat in the same realm, yes, and the Navy was 7%. Having said that, I still think that the political appetite to embrace a BRAC, I'm just very skeptical. Because the 2005 round really left a bad taste in people's mouths.
It didn't produce the savings.
It did not, but a lot of heartburn. So it was a high price to pay for very meager results. And our friend here from the Pentagon, John, who was part of that process, he did everything he could to convince us otherwise, but I mean, it's still, I mean, in any Congress, it's always going to be an uphill battle to make that case, no matter what, no matter how eloquent and powerful the advocate is. And so, I mean, that combined with the fact that, you know, the uncertainty in the world, I think is also another reason why I think members are really sort of asking themselves why, you know, what's the impetus for downsizing the footprint? Senator McCain is still a very strong advocate for it. Adam Smith on the House Armed Services Committee as well. So, but again, I think right now, as far as BRAC is concerned, really the real interesting question is just whether or not it's going to be part of the president's budget. And I'm kind of a skeptic that it will be. I don't know what Rob's take is.
And other efficiencies as well.
Sure. Well, I think there are a couple of questions that we have to ask. And one is truly what metric are we using to look at where we need to be with base structure and capitalization? Because remember, base capitalization is a readiness generator. So it is there to generate readiness. So the question is what's that right balance? And it has to be based on analysis done today. You know, the 2005 analysis with a parametric adjustment to it is not really what we see today. And then the question, too, becomes, well, what end strength are we talking about? So it's end strength also drives that issue. Another element that needs to be part of the discussion that I think doesn't get mentioned often enough, and that is there's no doubt that there's overcapitalization areas, but the more fundamental question is do you do that more efficiently by eliminating bases? Or you do that more efficiently by looking at structure by structure and capital infrastructure on bases piece by piece and saying, this is antiquated, this is too expensive to maintain, let's take that out of the inventory and then adjust on a base level. Because I argue this, that if we're going to be making these decisions about taking out bases, we better be doggone sure, because in many of those instances, these bases are near population centers. So once you take them out of the inventory, you'll never get them back. It's politically impossible, I think, to go back in.
The land becomes valuable and
exactly.
Develops.
And you're not going to come back and repurchase that, which is what you need to do. So you better be doggone certain about it. I do think that there's economies that you can get by going base by base and saying, these are older buildings, costing us too much to maintain, too much to heat and cool, whatever it may be. Let's take them out of the inventory and then look at capitalization in that way. So that's another efficiency that I think we can look at and make sure that we get it right. If you just look at it on a total base and the decision is either, you know, we move some mission sets around or we close the base, I think you miss many times the more substantive issue, and that is how do we get down to the micro level to understand where we can attain efficiencies.
Well, you've mentioned readiness. I do want to go there next and invite both of your views on the readiness, what you see as the major readiness challenges facing the Navy. Again, a lot of this gets tied up back in the budget conversation, but understanding that we've covered a lot of that, more about where you think the Navy needs to focus its energies and its priorities in terms of improving readiness. Sure. Let me start with you.
Well, I think it begins with the Navy's effort on the Optimized Fleet Response Plan, and that is when you have a service availability schedule, that ship had better be there at the yard getting the work done. And when we unzip that ship, you better get every bit of the work that's done on board that ship, so when it goes back to sea, you know it's going to have full capability, and we don't zip the ship back up before everything is done. When you do that, then you don't have hiccup in deployment schedules. We saw some of that happen this time with our carrier strike group. We saw compressed training cycles, and while when I spoke with the leaders in the Navy, they said, well, that was an acceptable risk. The problem is that risk doesn't manifest itself until you get out there in an environment where you are contested and now your pilots have to fly and have the full scope of the experience that they should be getting in their pre-deployment workups that, if compressed, create a real challenge for them. So I think the most fundamental question we need to ask about Navy readiness is making sure that every one of those schedules is being met, ships get to the yard, that training schedules are met, that when airplanes go to the depot, that they get in, that they get out, that the work gets done, that we as members of Congress understand that we are too at the focal point of helping the Navy generate readiness. So if there's a hiccup like a CR, that creates instability there, it pushes things out. We've seen this CR this time now has delayed 14 ship availabilities. Now, while it's only been delayed a short term, I argue that even that short-term disturbance there is going to reverberate in the deployment cycles of those ships and what the Navy is now faced with. So Congress has its job, too, to make sure that it doesn't create the uncertainty or the hiccups in what the optimized fleet response plan is supposed to be doing.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a multi-layered problem here in terms of readiness with the Navy. Part of it is obviously budget and the CR, which, is, if we, can get that virtuous cycle I mentioned earlier, that can fix that. But having said all that, even with a healthy funding stream, the public yards have issues. I mean, they're antiquated and they are really backed up in terms of the work that is piling up out there. So again, I think we had a great hearing this past week to talk about a plan to modernize the public yards, which is long overdue. It's an interesting sort of political question because readiness does not have the same kind of built-in constituency that shipbuilding does,
right.
Because you've got the industrial base coalition lobbying efforts, which is this kind of new trend that is very successful in Washington, whether it's amphibs or carriers or submarines. You have this built-in constituencies around the country that come to Washington and lobby for boosting shipbuilding. You don't have the same kind of political network when you talk about readiness in public yards. I mean, the work is pretty much concentrated in those places where the yards are located. Having said all that, I mean, I think that the reality is so stark that it's kind of a must-do item for Congress to upgrade and modernize the shipyards. But even again, that's going to take a decade or so to achieve that goal. And again, I think particularly with the attack subs, which is pretty close to home, certainly in my district, they are kind of the poor cousins in the ranking with the public yards. The carriers and the SSBNs get first dibs in terms of repair availabilities. So you have these horror stories like the Albany, where a commander spent his entire term as the captain of the ship on shore. He never got to command the ship because the delays were so long. The Boise, which Rob mentioned, is another one that's either been decertified or close to decertification because of the delays. I was just on the Connecticut, which we were just talking about earlier here. It was a repair availability that was supposed to take roughly about 2 years, a little bit less, took 4 years. And I mean, so at the same time, we've got combatant commanders out there screaming for attack subs. And again, the public yards, even if we got them modernized with a magic wand, we still would have issues in terms of getting that work done. So, Admiral Moore, we talked to him the other day about the fact that, we've got to maybe start looking at that one shipyard concept that Admiral McCoy had, where the private yards get brought in to do some of the repair work. That's not happening, frankly, to the same degree as it was a number of years ago. But, it's great that I think we're about to embark on this great shipbuilding boost, but as you said, I mean, if the existing fleet is not, being used to the extent that we need to do right today, then something is kind of out of alignment.
Yeah. Just to stick with this idea on modernizing the depots and other aspects of the industrial base, there's also obviously this overall innovation or modernization and innovation agenda in defense that is looking ahead to the threats of the future. Where do you believe in your travels with the Navy and the hearings and all your interactions that you're seeing innovation that you think is just outstanding and proud to be American? And where do you feel that we need to make progress?
So again, I think if you look at submarines, which I kind of am close to, the modular construction that is really a phenomenon really since the Virginia class came on the system has been a really outstanding success. I mean, the old way of building submarines, was just a lot more labor intensive and inefficient than the modular construction, and I think that that sort of plug and play, using components that you can sort of insert rather than building everything, all at the same time from the ground up, is really, I think, the way of the future, and I think really all aspects of shipbuilding is really sort of going to go in that direction.
Yeah. What are your thoughts on how the Navy's doing with innovation?
I think they're doing a spectacular job. If you look at some of the advancements that have taken place here recently, the ships are very capable platforms, but what you do to be able to extend the reach of that ship are some of these new systems. the advanced radars, the SPY-6 radars, and what they can do to look out extended distances. And then what you're doing with systems to link all the different elements, aircraft, ships, Link 16s, another ability to really leverage all these assets out there, the whole concept of distributed lethality, to make sure that everything you have out there comes to avail. Using new technology, too, that gets us ahead of our adversaries, things like railgun, which has been directed energy lasers. As you know, right now we're at 150 kilowatt laser. I think we will, in the not too distant future, be where we'd like to be, which is a 300 kilowatt laser, even deploying one on the Ponce. The good thing is the Navy, too, says, listen, we're not going to wait for technological nirvana before we deploy these systems. So they put a laser on the Ponce, worked it, used it, learned a lot from it, now have taken that learning curve, applied it in the further development of that weapon system. The same now with railgun. It's going through its trials, looking at pulse power units, which we've been able to really reduce the size. Look at battery power. I mean, this gun now can fire a sustained rate of 20 rounds per minute. That's pretty miraculous in what we've been able to do. The one place, too, that I think the Navy is really looking at things the way they should is not just in the aggressive development of this, but it's making sure, too, that we are fielding these systems as quickly as we can. So we have to shorten the time. I've always been an advocate to say that for us, time is a strategic challenge. You cannot take 20 years to get a concept to operation. You just can't do that anymore because our adversaries do it much more quickly than we do. So the ability to go from concept to operation in a much shorter period of time, shorter than our adversaries, is critical. And then look for ways, too, that we can take advantage of efficiency so that when we spend our dollar, we spend it more efficiently and with greater outcomes than our adversaries. And those are places where I think the Navy is getting this. They're beginning down that path to make sure that we are doing things in a more timely manner. So we're delivering systems ahead of schedule, or at the very least on schedule, and we're doing more with our dollars than our adversaries are. And that's a place where, again, technology is used to our advantage.
And Congress can actually help with that.
Yes.
I mean, the one thing that, again, I think our subcommittee's done some pretty good work on is really, challenging the appropriators and some of the folks in the Pentagon to really, break out of the annual budget sort of system of appropriating and authorizing ship construction and really looking more at multi-year approaches that, it just creates tremendous opportunities for efficiencies, continuous production, which again is a great way to help the supply chain who, again, would be sort of unshackled from the sort of annual, soap opera in terms of whether or not, things are going to be funded. Right. And frankly, I think it's almost, we have no choice but to go that route as we look at how do we fund a 355-ship Navy. And again, I think it's the National Sea-Based Deterrence Fund obviously was the real poster child in terms of really promoting these efficient authorities to really, again, take advantage of ways to just reduce time and costs in terms of ship construction, which is the name of the game.
Right. I just want to ask one more question, then I'll throw it to the audience, and it's related to the last, which is specifically on unmanned air, surface, and subsurface. What's your sense, and I'll throw that open in whichever order you'd like to go, what's your sense of the promise that's there and the degree to which the Navy is exploiting any promise you see there?
Well, I think those systems are critical. They really are the force multiplier, whether you look at what's going on with Triton right now to give that situational awareness for the Navy, that persistence, too, to where you have a continual battle space awareness is critical. Also, undersea systems. I think there is such opportunity there with undersea systems. The key for us with that is as we develop that technology, is to make sure that we have the direction to begin to refine those concepts and bring them down. So instead of going out with multiple vehicles and continuing along those lines in too many directions, is to say, okay, we've taken these technologies, we've proven them, now let's begin to get to a down select point where we can now operationalize those technologies. But it's amazing what's going on out there and what the Navy is doing in developing that. If we're going to make sure that we apply them, again, with the element of time, is we have to be able to refine the research, development, testing, and evaluation to say, okay, at this particular point, we're at a learning point where we have to now operationalize this. And that to me, is the key with getting that technology out to the fleet.
Right. I mean, again, as we, there's going to be a gap between the time that we see the fleet get to the numbers that the FSA called for. So in the meantime, I mean, we do need to extend the arms of both surface ships and submarines. And again, the unmanned technology, is just an incredible opportunity to really get more value out of the fleet that we have right now. I would just say that Congress needs a little help on this one, just in terms of, getting a better understanding from the Navy just about, what they want and where they want to go. And there's been, a little bit of stop and start in terms of some of the organizational, systems within the Pentagon in terms of, developing that kind of technology. But Admiral Murs,
Navy stood down their office. For instance,
that's
on
right.
that,
And
as
so,
an
but Admiral
example.
Murs is now, I think, really prepared to really take this on, and he's really, I think, a great guy who's capable of, achieving that sort of larger vision that we can really then, I think, work together.
Great.
I would agree. Let me just add this. I think the Navy's at the point right now with all of these different unmanned technologies out there is they have to get at the point now to say, okay, let's refine those concepts and now let's operationalize them. Because at some point with RDT&E, you say, okay, we're at a learning curve where we have to be able to apply this. And I think the Navy's at that point right now.
Great. Okay, here's what we're going to do. We're going to open it up to the audience. We'll have mics that come around. If I call on you, please give your name. And if you have an affiliation, your affiliation. Please make it a question and one only. So let me see hands of folks who want to ask. We'll have one right up here.
Hello, Megan Eckstein with USNI News. Thank you both for being here. You both mentioned ship maintenance. I wanted to know, so shipbuilding obviously caught traction and has about $20 billion in the omnibus deal. Aviation maintenance is even caught in traction sort of as a crisis right now and got quite a plus up of money. On the ship maintenance side though, short of calling it a crisis, how does the Armed Services Committee sort of get more traction for more spending in there, and what more can the Navy maybe do to help push that cause?
Well, I think this year's NDAA is the way for us to really direct the attention to that, and the numbers to me speak to themselves. When you delay these availabilities, when you're looking at what happens with deployment schedules, all those things reverberate throughout the fleet, and they have an extended impact down the road. I think to me it's very easy for us to make the case for additional dollars there. And we have to look at it too in this year's budget as the number comes out, because there's going to be an effort to say, well, let's equally send money to all the different branches. And while, listen, I understand that. Last year we did some things to try to make the Army whole because there were some shortfalls there. I think we are going to have to argue to say there are some things we have to put into the Navy budget to help catch up. And there may be somewhat of an imbalance there as far as how resources are allocated amongst all the service branches. And listen, I understand the competition there, but it's also about making priority decisions and understanding that we don't get to 355 when we don't have presence if those ships can't get to the yard, if they can't get repaired, because they're not available then for deployment. And we see that with the Albany and the Boise. And that's only going to build if we miss these ship availabilities. Already now, even with short-term delays, we're going to see that reverberate not just in the coming months, but the coming years. So to me, that's a very compelling argument for us to make.
Yeah, unfortunately, world events are, creating an environment where I think the argument is going to be pretty easy to make. If you look again, just in the last month, in terms of the missile strike in Syria or the Vinson, the Navy's value is on the front pages every single day, and Admiral Harris's decision to extend the Vinson's deployment by an additional month, is just that actually will be Exhibit A in terms of just how really kind of knife edge the options are for the Navy leadership and the President in terms of just trying to cover the globe right now. Even talk about the North Atlantic or Putin either. So so as I said, I think between the carrier gap, some of the stories that we were talking about in terms of the delays in maintenance, I think as I said, the evidence is pretty strong in terms of making the case.
Great. Next question is right up here.
Hi, my name is Eric Lair. I'm an independent engineering consultant for the FAA and the military. My question is we talk about impressive technologies that are being developed and deployed, for what threat are they being designed for? What is the threat that the Navy, these new advanced technologies, are being designed to defend? What's going to invade this country potentially? What's going to invade this country if we don't deploy these technologies?
Well, I think there's, the 5 threats that we see out there. You have China, North Korea, Russia, and Iran, as well as the threat of terrorism. All of those continuing to approach the country. We look at extended range, extended also denial of our presence in areas to make sure that you keep things like shipping lanes open. The ability for us to have presence there, and then the ability for us too in that A2, A&D environment to be able to, if necessary, engage. And remember too that with the technologies from our other adversaries now, we have to stand off further and further distances. We have to have technology where we can make sure that we can get inside there, so if there is an engagement, we can make sure that we can not only protect but also engage. So these elements of new technology, whether it's new radars that reach out further, whether it's new weapon systems that now have additional distance, greater lethality. You look at something like the railgun, reaches out a tremendous distance. It is also operable against missile technology. So some pretty amazing stuff there. The same with lasers, aircraft, missiles. All those technologies allow us in this world of worrying about missile threats, but also worrying about operating in the contested environment. And I can't emphasize that enough. We are always now, from this point on, going to operate in highly contested environments. So our weapon systems need to ensure that we can engage and survive in those environments. Because if we can't, then this is going to be a big issue. And we also have to have weapon systems, too, that are simple and fundamental in how they operate. Because we're going to exist in environments where we're going to be engaged in the cyber realm, so comms and all those things are going to be at issue there. So, we need to not only look about technology, but how do we operate in that contested environment where many of those things are going to be a challenge for us. We might be blinded, we might not have proper comms. What can we do with those weapon systems where they can operate as effectively there? That's where we can, I think, really apply technology and make sure that we have that advantage in the environments that we expect to face, not only today, but in the future.
So General Scaparrotti, the head of the European Command, and his predecessor, General Breedlove, when they've been before committee, and some other pretty, I think, credible witnesses like Admiral Stavridis, who was the commander out there, their description of what's happening in the North Atlantic, just to take one example, is that you go back to 2007 or 2008, President Bush actually closed the air base in Iceland for submarine hunting because it was just unnecessary at that point. Today, you have Admiral Stavridis coming before the committee and saying that submarine activity is now about 70 to 80% of what it was during the Cold War. And the response to that right now, because of the fleet size, is that we're playing zone defense, to use General Scaparrotti's term, which is why that undersea technology could be a real big help in terms of the Greenland, Iceland, UK gap as far as trying to have some coverage there. And and by the way, we're reopening the base in Iceland. That was in President Obama's budget. So, I don't think anyone, relishes the fact that we're in just a different environment right now, but we are. And that's where, again, I think, given the fact that we're somewhat short-handed in terms of the fleet size, having that additional technology, I think would be a huge help.
This does obviously get to the challenge for folks who sit on House Armed Services Committee or like-minded national security-oriented committees, presumably, and how you translate to the Congress at large your sense of challenge and threat. Can you I'd love to hear you talk a little bit about how you feel that, how hard or easy that is in the current environment to make the case to a public which is probably quite divided over what it believes the challenge set to be and what we should be spending for it. So I'll start over here. I'm sorry.
Yeah. So, obviously that's been a challenge since even when I first came to Congress 10 years ago, when people were like, why do we need submarines? And you sort of you have to make the case on obviously a national strategic level. No one's going to, be very impressed with sort of a local parochial argument, and they shouldn't be. That's, when you're talking about these kinds of investments, you've got to make a much more comprehensive case. As I said, and to Megan's question, I mean, some degree events have really kind of changed the political environment, and as a result, I think people really don't ask the question, why do we need submarines anymore? And it goes back to the point I made at the outset, which is that the force structure assessment really was Secretary Mavis's undertaking. I think that's an important point for people to remember. I mean,
that there's a bipartisan.
That's right. That this is
sensibility
not, an agenda of one administration. And again, it's such a big undertaking that we just can't possibly move something, on that sort of limited political base. And so. So again, I mean, I think that the industrial-based coalitions, which I mentioned earlier, are also very effective in terms of spreading the word outside of just coastal districts, that this is an important issue. And even with all that said, I mean, we still have lots of work to do because, as you point out, the competition is going to be, incredibly intense. Personally, I feel that the Budget Control Act, which was premised on the notion that sequestration was going to bring reasonable people to the table and we were going to get rid of indiscriminate cuts, I mean, obviously has been a bust, and we really need to get out of that box in terms of being able to move forward. And the budget deal, by the way, which we're voting on tomorrow, actually, was part of the raising of the caps, partial raising of the caps, which Speaker Boehner had negotiated before he departed. As you may recall, that was a 2-year deal that he negotiated. So. That I think is really the question of the day, and 2018 is going to make 2017 look like almost child's play in terms of just how do we deal with the overall structure of the Budget Control Act.
One of the things I think that both Joe and I have worked on to get other members plugged in is the next step beyond the secure brief. You get them a classified brief, you show them the charts, and their eyes kind of glaze over. But I think the most effective way that we can reach members that are not on the House Armed Services Committee is to take them on travel with us, to get them out to see sailors, Marines, soldiers, and airmen forward deployed. So get them on the deck of an aircraft carrier, get them on a sub embark, get them on the deck of a surface ship. And what I have found is when we're able to do that, they come back convinced. And the strictest of budget hawks now come back and all of a sudden have a defense hawk mentality, which is good. And we're doing that again on Friday, going down to Fleet Forces Command so people can understand, step on board a ship and see what are the things we need to do. What happens when this ship doesn't go to sea? What are the sailors doing on board? What does it take to launch aircraft? What does it take for this sub to embark? And what does it take for it to go to places around the world? Just to see that and to see the dedication that our sailors and Marines have there, to me, is critical. And it tells a better story than any words that come out of my mouth, or maybe not Joe's mouth. Joey's very, very effective, but for me, I find the most convincing way is for us to just get people out there who aren't on our Armed Services Committee. The folks on Armed Services Committee hear it and get it, but we need to get folks out like the folks on the Budget Committee, like the folks on the Appropriations Committee. And when we do, when we're able to get them to go out and see folks forward deployed and see what it takes to have that presence around the world, it speaks for itself. So the challenge for us is so many members, so little time. So we just have to do more of that. But that's the way that we can really get folks to our side. And when it comes to the debates, they say, hey, listen, there shouldn't be a question about the commitment we make as a nation to build our Navy to that 355 ships, or to have that presence, or to maintain those ships that support our sailors and Marines.
Okay, there's a question right here.
Thanks. I think probably everybody in this room would agree.
Can you just introduce
I'm sorry,
yourself?
I'm Steve Rummerman. I'm with a company called Lone Star Analysis, and we crunch numbers. And I think everybody who looks at numbers, and probably everybody in this room, would agree that the Budget Control Act didn't achieve its goals. My question would be, I hear a lot of analogies, kicking the can down the road, false economies. Is there credible estimate of how much the BCA and the budget cap and the continual CRs have driven inefficiency into the system? We've clearly made a bunch of choices that were short-term and really unfortunate. Do we have a sense of how much of a bill we've created for ourselves by doing that?
I mean, that would be a great question for CBO and CRS to come back to, because I mean, certainly, I think intuitively, we know there are inefficiencies, if nothing else, because it just created this stop-start. I mean, the shutting down of the government, actually, we do have some pretty good numbers in terms of the impact that it had, both in terms of the overall economy as well as the government. But whether the total tally for Budget Control Act, I've never seen it sort of calculated, but it's, as I said, it's, I don't know politically, how we can pull off what the skinny budget proposed, which was, an unfortunate sort of, picture of, defense has to be paid for at the expense of cancer research or education. That's an unacceptable, nobody's that good politically to ever pull that off, and they shouldn't be, because it's, in my opinion, a false choice. So, but again, how we get to that point where we can really get people to sort of talk about, either lifting the caps as we have, in the past, or just getting rid of it is, that's going to be the question of the day, I think, for 2018.
Okay, I got one right here.
My name is Rick Burgess with Seapower magazine. Do you have any concerns, Congressman, with the industrial base as regard to submarine building, with the importance of getting the Columbia out to sea for its deterrent patrol on time, and then also the need to build more attack submarines? Do you have any concerns that the industrial base will be able to meet those commitments without threatening the Columbia program?
Well, it's a very timely question. This weekend I was in Newport News for the christening of the USS Indiana, our newest nuclear submarine. Had an opportunity there to talk to the principals in both Electric Boat and HII, and in my conversations with them as well as the Navy, I am confident that we can do this. The key is charting the right path and putting us on the right ramp speed to be able to get there. And again, having a discussion about what pieces need to come together. How do we make sure that we send the demand signal to the industry to where they have the certainty to say, okay, you're serious about going from whatever, 2 to 3 Virginia-class submarines each year, that we're going to make the investment to make sure we get Columbia delivered on time. As you know, I have asked that we stay in constant contact with the Navy. There have been just a few hiccups with Columbia class. I want to make sure we're on top of that immediately to understand what we're going to do to mitigate those circumstances, to make sure there are no hiccups there. But I am confident that the industry has the ability to do that. We're going to ask them to do some things to ramp up, which means they're going to have to add people, they're going to have to add infrastructure in order to do that. I think they're very willing and capable to do that as long as we send them the demand signal to say, Congress is serious about this, and this is where we want to go, and this is our long-range plan to be able to get there. So I have no hesitancy that the industry can do that.
And the other point I would add is that, when we talked about some of the things the Navy's doing good, I mean, that's where the lessons learned from Virginia construction, I think, are going to be applied towards Ohio replacement, Columbia, which, again, I think is really very promising in terms of, not having setbacks in terms of the way the program moves forward. And I would also say that the Sea-Based Deterrence Fund efficiencies that we authorize really still haven't been sort of factored in totally in terms of the Navy's projections. I actually think that if they really embrace some of those authorities and implement them, that we can even buy back some time in terms of the schedule for Columbia construction.
Great. John?
Hi, John Conger. I am a non-resident senior advisor at CSIS. I have a question about FY18 and the BCA. So obviously the BCA is the law of the land today. Can you characterize a couple different risks that we have if we can't make a deal on FY18? Can you talk, you talked a little bit about the $5 or $6 billion extra you need in shipbuilding. What happens if you go all the way back down to BCA levels in the out years, and what's at risk there? And on a related note, how do you incentivize the industry to make the capacity investments that they need to make in order to accommodate these future requirements if they can't trust that Congress is going to make a long-term budget deal that will ensure those higher levels of spending.
So, I mean, I would say, one thing in terms of Columbia, which was mentioned earlier, I actually think people should feel very confident about Congress's commitment, even with the BCA, even with CRs. And I say that because if you go back to December, when we did do the CR, there was an anomaly, a very large anomaly that, on a bipartisan basis, was inserted in the CR to make sure that Columbia stayed on track. And again, on a degree of difficulty in terms of doing anomalies, about 0 to 10, it's about a 15, getting that done in there. But again, I think it really showed that, there really is very strong consensus about the fact that, our strategic needs can't wait any longer because of the delays in past years with Columbia. So I really think that one is gonna move forward, almost in any scenario. In terms of just the overall defense budget and trying to get on track to the 355, that's where I think the BCA really is still just a huge hurdle that we have to overcome. And it is time for us to get started on 2018 the minute the ink is dry on President Trump's signature on the 2017 budget, because we've really got to get cracking.
And John, I think too that the authorization process shouldn't be overlooked here. I think the House Armed Services Committee can really drive the bus on this to highlight what needs to happen. We've had good discussions with the appropriators. I think they understand the true needs there. The budgeters also, that's why it's critical to get them into the details of what happens with that. There are always the machinations back and forth about where we are. I think the calendar this year is our enemy. To be able to look at all this, I'd love for the Speaker to keep us in town in August so we can actually get these appropriations bills done. I think you'd see an awful lot of bipartisanship break out if you kept people through August in Washington until these appropriations bills get done.
It is a particularly lovely month to be.
It is. Yes. It is. But I think it's something like that to where those things could happen and need to happen. Short of that, we are going to find ourselves back into another cycle of CRs. And as Joe said, in that case, what we have to do after having done our job on the appropriations side is to argue what anomalies need to be in there. Now, you won't be able to cover all of them, and there'll still be that uncertainty going forward. But if we lay the groundwork through authorization as to where we need to go on that ramp speed to 355, and we emphasize that, and we never miss an opportunity to let people know how important that is, that does reverberate to other decision makers in Washington, regardless of the mechanism that we end up with this year in where the dollars come from. As Joe said, we were able to, because of the battle that took place almost over a 3-year period, to get dollars into to the Columbia-class program through the National Sea-Based Deterrence Fund. It began to stick. I mean, initially, appropriators said, no, we're not going to do that. We don't do it that way. I think that's critical. Another thing that we need to do this year, Joe and I have talked about, is we have funded ships in the past, some of the ships through incremental funding. If we really want to leverage the most out of the dollars we have, we need to use incremental funding. I know the appropriators don't like it, but if we push the issue, I think that we can convince them of the value of using those dollars and what we can do by using incremental funding.
Okay, we're going to group a final 2 questions for you, and we're going to come over here. I have one here and then one back there. So up here first.
Thank you. Good morning. My name is Yang from China Xinhua News Agency. You just mentioned that China is one of 5 major threats that your Navy is preparing for. Could you explain more specifically which threats that China is posing for the United States? Thank you.
Oh, we'll get
Sure.
the second one, and then we'll
Yeah.
do them together. Yeah.
Morning, Peter Pennington, no particular affiliation except I come from the country that's building the Dreadnought.
Yes.
Did I hear the panel actually say that the Navy is dependent on public yards that are not performing? And?
Okay, that was 2. There
Yes.
you go. Thank you for limiting to 1 there.
Sure.
Yes.
Well, we'll begin with the threat that China poses to us. I think it's at a number of different levels. If you look at Chinese presence with offensive capability in the Spratlys and even in the Paracel Islands there, that island chain that's being militarized. I think that's an extension of Chinese presence into the area that I think is threatening to not only the United States but also the region in being able to freely operate in that particular area. Also, the extended capability of Chinese operations in the mainland there to force U.S. Forces and others to stand off with the ability to reach those fleets with those capabilities. I think all those are mounting threats in the region. So I do think that there's only one purpose that you would pursue those efforts for, and that would be to intimidate either your neighbors or your allies or your adversaries in the area. And certainly, if that's the intent, it has been successful in that attempt. And to go to the issue on the public yards. Having a public yard there in Virginia, yes. The answer, unfortunately, is that the public yards are underperforming, and it's only because we haven't made the investments there. Just in a place like Norfolk, when our shipbuilders don't even have a bathroom that they can go to that functions, I think that's pretty fundamental. So we have to be able to make those investments there to get those yards back up to where they need to be. That, again, is not something that's going to take place next year or even the year after. And we are going to have a steady flow of ships into those yards. Another thing to remember, too, we place a lot of emphasis on building these ships, but we have to place as much, if not more, emphasis in maintaining those ships, because as we grow this Navy, we have to be able to maintain those ships. And the hiccups we've seen in the last 2 or 3 years with ship maintenance on a roller coaster ride, where we have a wave of ships that come into the yards and then that work disappears, is not the formula to sustain a skilled workforce either in public or private yards. And as Joe said, we're going to have to reach over probably on the private side to get some capacity there to be able to address this bow wave. But if we don't make the investments both in the infrastructure but also in the people in those yards, the investment in the skilled craftsmen and workers in those yards, to me, is the critical element of what we have to do to make sure we have the ship maintenance ability out there across the workforce to make sure that we can get ships into the maintenance facility on time and get them out on time so that, again, they meet those deployment schedules. Optimized Fleet Response Plan only works if we do that.
Yeah, I mean, I think I agree with every word he said about the public yards, so I'm not going to, reiterate it. And as far as China goes, I mean, the footnote that I would add is that the decision by the International Court of The Hague regarding the UNCLOS claim by the Philippines in terms of China's territorial claims, to me, I think really does powerfully underscore the notion that their sort of behavior is really causing great interference with freedom of navigation in just an unacceptable way in terms of international norms, and so. I don't think anyone's relishing for a fight. And Admiral Harris, when we've been out to PACOM a couple times, certainly reiterates that point. Having said that, when you have a ruling that really is as pretty animated and adamant in terms of what the court identified as a violation of international law, that's something that the world community just can't ignore. And at some point, I think. We have an obligation as with many allies in that part of the world to make sure that FONOPS and just visible pushback is happening that just I think confirms the international freedom of navigation. And unfortunately, China has really not responded to the court's decision in a way that's very encouraging. That we're going to find that sweet spot.
Well, I want to thank you both very much for your time today. I also want to thank our series sponsors, Lockheed Martin and Huntington Ingalls International, and I want to thank our partners at USNI. As always, for this Maritime Security Dialogue, please join me in thanking the members.
Thank you. Thank you.